So welcome everyone. My name is Hannah Scott and I am the program director for the Center for Cooperatives in the College of Food, Agricultural, and Environmental Sciences at Ohio State University. Our team provides management services to the Mid-America Cooperative Council. And we're excited to talk to you today and have a guest expert talking today about employee retention strategies. Before we jump into Shawn's presentation, I wanted to take just a moment to share a little bit more about MAC, which is a multi-state nonprofit trade association, and members are located across really the heart of Mid-America. And the council has a mission to promote, foster, and enhance the values of cooperatives. Since 2021, the council has provided educational programs that have engaged almost 700 attendees. And online roundtables like this are really meant to connect members and co-op stakeholders with experts like Shawn on current and emerging issues that are facing cooperatives. If you don't already get emails from MAC, we invite you to sign up for the email list to get information about programs straight to your inbox. We work hard not to spam you, but to provide you with useful information. And our team at the Center for Cooperatives provides assistance to entrepreneurs, educates the community, and generates knowledge about the cooperative business model. And we have a special focus on food, agriculture, and rural communities. And you can connect with us also directly. We welcome those connections and collaborations. You have our email addresses there on the screen, as well as information about how to find us online and how to sign up for our information. I'm going to give just a few housekeeping items before we turn it over to our special guest today. So we want this to be interactive and useful to folks. So keep in mind that you can ask questions throughout the session. We just ask that you use the chat function on the Zoom toolbar until we get to the time we have reserved for Q&A. And when we have time for Q&A, feel free to jump in whatever way is comfortable for you. We are recording today's program. It's going to be shared with folks who registered. And then you can check out recordings of roundtables on MAC's website. So we have a little bit of on-demand learning there if you aren't able to make it live. And at the end of today's session, you'll be redirected to an evaluation. We really appreciate your feedback. It does help us improve future roundtables and other learning opportunities. And so we appreciate your responses. And we'll share with you a couple of different ways that you can provide that feedback. So today, we are really excited to be exploring the topic of employee retention strategies. And we have a special guest with us, Shawn Miller with S. Miller Consulting. Shawn provides senior level human resources support, connecting people to processes to achieve alignment and higher performance. He has extensive experience in human resources and senior operations leadership for companies with diverse product lines and structures, including agricultural cooperatives, as well as medium-sized manufacturers, food processors, and nonprofits. Shawn has also been an entrepreneur, so he brings that experience to his work, and he's a frequent speaker at conferences and professional associations, and a contributor to professional periodicals with the various certifications. So Shawn, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today and your expertise. We're going to jump right in. I'm going to turn control over to you. So I will stop my share so you can share your slides and your expertise. And we'll watch the chat and encourage everybody to jump in with questions.
Okay. All right. So yeah, thank you everybody for the opportunity to be here today. Looking forward to sharing some information with you. I understand there's a Q&A session at the end. That's my favorite part. So I'll try to leave, plenty of time for that. A lot of information here. I sometimes present this and it can be, up to a half a day presentation. So I've consolidated and summarized quite a bit. And so I want to invite anybody that's participating in this, if you'd like more information, dig down a little bit more, talk a little bit more about any of this, because it is going to be highly summarized. I would be more than happy to talk with anybody. You can feel free to email me or call me. I'm always happy to share information and just get to know people and network in that way. And so I'll have some contact information at the end that you can feel free to reach out to me for. So what we'll be covering today on kind of retention is I want to first kind of define what turnover is. So we'll talk a little bit about that, talk a little bit about some turnover trends and some perceptions that have kind of floated around over the years regarding turnover today and what's kind of how that's changed, and during most of our careers. And for some of us, that goes back into the 80s. For others, it might just be, COVID, but there's been certainly some trends. I just want to share a little bit of information on that, talk a little bit about why people leave and the costs associated with that. But most of the time I want to spend talking about strategies and keeping people. So that's going to be our agenda today, what we're going to address. So I want to talk first I want to just talk about what turnover means, what it doesn't mean. And there's not necessarily a hard and fast definition for this. I think that my definition here is pretty close to, I think, what most people would consider turnover. Although there's total turnover and then there's a turnover that we kind of have control over. So in terms of what we're going to discuss today, this is the number of employees that leave an organization in a manner that's not planned, it's not controllable, and not part of an overall organizational strategy. So this is a little bit different than full turnover, all turnover, because this is going to be a focus on what we can influence as a management team in our organization. And I would say that there's a difference between turnover and attrition. Attrition is going to be more of those things that are kind of outside of our control. Things that are just going to naturally happen, like retirements. There might be changes in the business condition. There might be a change in strategy. An organization might decide to reduce their size or to get, to sell off a certain entity or something. There's of course just the natural, death and disability piece. People go off for military service, just anything that kind of happens naturally. So that's not really what we're focusing on today as much. These things are controlled a little bit more by overall strategy. And succession planning, of course, is part of this. But we're going to be talking about the unplanned events that causes disruptions when people quit or we have to terminate somebody for various reasons. Primarily that comes because of fit or for cause or because of their ability to do the job. So that's going to be our focus today. And but I want to look a little bit before we get started on kind of what the trends have looked like over the years. And this I find a little bit interesting, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but there's been some perceptions over the years that we're kind of dealing with something that is changing and we're not able to really influence it very much. It's like a change in culture, a change in the environment. And there's kind of this perception, there's been this continual and significant shift. And it's nearly impossible anymore to create a situation where people want to stay long term. And that is reflected a little bit. This goes back a few years. This would have been, toward the beginning of my career, article published in 1994. And this article kind of represented a change in thinking when I would have kind of joined the workforce in late 80s, early 90s. And that thinking was that lifetime employment was gone, that somehow there had been some significant shift in the fact that, at one time you could start working for a company and you would be there the rest of your life, and that was kind of the old culture, and that something had shifted and something had changed. And there definitely was a bit of a shift in that time. And this chart actually represents it. This shows turnover trends from 1979 to 2006. And if we look at that top line, that blue line, these are large organizations over 1,000 people. There was a definite shift from 1979 into really, it went into, it kind of continued into the early 90s. This chart shows it kind of leveling off around 2006. But that number to the left is the average number of years that somebody would have stayed in an organization. And actually, the way this is represented, this is a very particular representation. This is men aged 30 to 65, which would have, going back to in 1979, that would have been, a measure that you would have looked at more closely. And just to be consistent, this particular researcher had kind of maintained that. But what we see is the average tenure going from about 14 years down to a little over 10 years for these large organizations. And this does kind of reflect a change that was happening at the time. And this is primarily was larger organizations that realized they just had a lot of what they would refer to as, as redundancy, dead weight, inefficiencies. And this was just kind of a response to globalization, a response to a lot of it was in the car industry and with General Electric and those large companies where they were just kind of right sizing. And so there were a lot of people that in that time period lost their jobs. So that was kind of what's reflected here. But if we look at more of the mid-size and smaller organizations, which most of us are part of, and for a long time, this has primarily been where most people have worked. There wasn't that much of a shift. There was a little bit. The small organizations actually had less turnover, but that's kind of that trend that this is considering. So for those of us that have been around and kind of remember that shift happening, that's really what this is referring to. Now let's look at maybe a little bit longer, a little bit longer space and time. This is covering about a 60-year period, and this slide and the next one, which is going to be more recent, shows some pretty significant disruptions. And I would look at like that overall blue line, number of separations, and then the pink line is number of quits. In the the early part of the century, there was a lot of quits, a lot of separations, not much layoffs, but a lot of quits and a lot of separations, because the economy is transitioning more to a rural economy. This is people moving off the farms and joining the factories. And then in the 40s, that was World War II. A lot of people were quitting and joining the military, or they were leaving the job they were in to be part of a wartime economy. Once those disruptions were over, in 1950, there was a long, steady period of time. And so it wasn't until that previous chart I just showed back in 79 where there was a shift. So for those that were kind of lived through this period when it seemed like things were changing dramatically, kind of that subject of that Harvard Business Review article, that long period of stability from the 50s through the 70s, there was that shift for a few years with those larger organizations. And that's what that was representing. Now, if we look at more recent, this is what most of us have been feeling the last few years. This shows the recession in the early 2000s related to the Second Gulf War. It shows the Great Recession, quote unquote, Great Recession that was in 2008, 2009, and then COVID and the Great Resignation. So if we look at this, there's about a 12-year period of time between the Great Resignation and COVID where there was some pretty significant disruptions. And a lot of us felt that. And that has kind of led to kind of this perception that there's something that shifted in our economy, the generations have changed, and that it's just almost impossible to retain people for a long period of time. Now, I want to look at some statistics that I think are important for us to kind of help put this in perspective a little bit. If we look at another way to look at this rather than percentage of turnover, and I think this is a better way to look at it, the number of years somebody has been in a job. Now, this is again that going back to that chart of men from 1950, their age 59 to this is men age 59 to 62. So this is going to be when they hit the stablest part of the career path. And by the way, back in 1969, there was the higher percentage of men in the workforce. So for this statistic to be consistent, that was what this researcher chose to focus on. We see that the average tenure in the longest job actually went up from 1969 to 1998. And then looking at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, This goes back to 1981. Now, at this time, the Bureau of Labor Statistics was measuring then median years on the current job. So it just kind of took a snapshot in time. And at this time, it was 16 years and older. 16-year-olds, 16 to 20-year-olds tend to change jobs a lot. So they changed the statistic to reflect a little bit older population. But we can see that men and women were around 3.2 years in their average job. Now, if we then move forward, I just kind of picked a few years and I just pulled them out of the Bureau of Labor Statistics website. If we look then in 1998, and this is 25-year-olds are up, which is they decided to make that change. It's a little more stable workforce. That number is 4.7. Well, I would suspect if this number was 25-year-olds and greater, that 3.2 would be a little higher. 1998, it's 4.7. And I took a look at not last year. Last year is 4.8. So we actually see that number trending up over the years, which doesn't really feel, it's not really what it feels like to most of us as we're trying to create more stability with our workforce. So what does all this mean in terms of, if we were to kind of summarize this, aside from these large macro events, and we're definitely experiencing a little bit of generational shift. But if we have time today to talk about that, or if anybody had any questions about that, I think that's actually much less significant overall than what it sometimes feels like. But aside from those large events like COVID and the Great Resignation that have occurred recently, there's been a lot of consistency regarding how long people stay in their jobs. Now, what this means to us as we are attempting to improve our organizations and improve the tenure and improve retention, this is good news because there isn't some crazy dramatic thing happening out there in the world that we have no control over. Human nature, human psychology really hasn't changed that much. And so we can utilize our understanding of that to create a much more resilient workforce. Let's talk a little bit about what turnover costs. And when I do a larger presentation on this, I pull up some data from Gallup and organizations like that. I'm just going to kind of hit this from a high level. I think all of us know, just from an intuitive standpoint, it costs a lot of money when a key person leaves. And I've seen for rank and file folks numbers anywhere from $1,400 per person to $3,200 per person if they don't survive just the first 3-month period of time. So, and I think we all know there's a cost to this. It's kind of difficult to completely objectify and quantify, but there's going to be the cost of recruiting that person, the cost of the training and onboarding a new person. There's disruption on the business. When we lose somebody that's been there for a while, we lose a lot of institutional memory, a lot of tribal knowledge. That can be extremely significant when we lose a key person. Loss of intellectual capital, that person's skill and experience. There's disruption to continuity. There's just a lot of things that create costs associated with turnover that I think a lot of us just feel very intuitively. So that's one of the reasons why we want to focus on this. We want to try to minimize those costs, minimize that disruption. And again, this reasons that people leave. This is one we could probably spend a good half hour on because there's a lot of interesting data on this. And I've just kind of summarized it for us on this slide today. When people are surveyed in a controlled situation and asked why they're leaving an organization, a lot of them will say culture. Now that tends to be a catch-all for something, but what it's really saying is there was something about what they experienced on that job that caused them to leave. And I want us to kind of remember that when people leave, there was something about what they experienced on that job that caused them to want to leave and find something new. There's attraction to a better position. This could almost in some ways be kind of blended with attrition because, there's always going to be opportunities for people outside of our organizations. And, we can't really blame somebody for bettering ourselves. Some of this we can control, some of it we can't. We'll talk a little bit about how we can control this a little bit with succession planning and training. and things like that. Dissatisfaction with the current situation. Now, this is different than attraction to a different position. This means that there was something actively about their current situation that they didn't like and was their reason to leave. And people issues, their boss, their coworkers, and we'll find out a little bit later that actually that the relationship and the people issues tends to rise to the surface as the number one true reason why people leave. Lack of internal opportunities, um, lack of internal development opportunities, and of course, there's terminations. Now, the reason why I include terminations in the turnover portion that I try to coach people in learning how to control is because the reason somebody is terminated is often due to recruitment shortcomings, assessment and fit, issues with onboarding. And I could add to this, and I probably should have added to this, training and development. There's a lot that we can control as organizations that minimize the number of terminations we experience. So this leads to then us saying, well, let's try to figure out some way to retain people, and what does that strategy look like? We want to try, and the strategy really focuses on two things. One is creating a workforce that's resilient and committed. And we're always going to experience things like COVID. I mean, hopefully not exactly like that, but there'll always be disruptions in the workforce. There'll be things that happen in the external environment that cause disruptions. And a resilient workforce can respond to those. A couple of quick examples. One of the organizations I work with, which I would say does a very good job on retention strategies, during COVID, they actually increased their business a little bit. And then I actually was working for an organization that was doing fine. And then we were tied to the building trades, commercial building trades. And when the Great Recession hit in 2008, over half our orders went away overnight. And we had a pretty good resilient workforce, and we actually ended up becoming a lot better, finding areas where we needed to make some changes and improvements. And what came out of that a lot stronger than we were to begin with. So that's part of the retention strategy, is that when things get tough, people don't just move on. We created a workforce that's committed and resilient. And then the other side of the strategy, and this is just a very, very basic goal, is we just want to keep the good performers and key employees. That's just really the goal in all of this. So how can we motivate people to stay? This is often the question that's asked. This is what usually comes up as we're kind of navigating this. I'm going to suggest that even on just because on the surface this seems like the absolutely the right question to ask ourselves, how do we motivate people to stay? I'm going to suggest this actually might be the wrong question we should be asking, and I will explain that a little bit as we go through this. But motivating people to stay is different than creating that engaged workforce. And so I'm going to suggest, rather than us focusing on motivating people to stay in an organization, how do we create a situation in our organization where people are resilient, they're dedicated? Because sometimes a motivation can be what's typically called kind of the golden handcuffs. There may be just something that we do that makes it very difficult that person to leave. They might not want to be there, but they don't have a better option. They don't have a place to go. And a lot of times what I see this in organizations is you end up paying somebody so much that there's no way they're ever going to leave. And they end up being miserable, and their performance goes down over time. So even though this might seem like a great question to ask in the beginning, I'm going to suggest that what we should focus on is employee engagement. Now, this term is a very specific term in kind of the organizational development world. It's not necessarily a real specific term in terms of the vernacular, but I wanted to provide a definition for it, and then we're going to look at how this definition applies to retaining employees. This is the level of an employee's enthusiasm, dedication, and motivation, the degree to which an employee goes above and beyond what is required, the measure of an employee's commitment and connection to organization in a way that results in meaningfulness and a high level of effectiveness. This is the overall goal that we want to have for all employees in our organization, the culture that we want to build, the structure that we want to build within our organizations. Now, where does this play in directly to retaining employees? Well, if we were just to look at retention, the retention piece of this, I could probably make an argument that all of it affects retention. But in terms of a one-to-one, it's dedication, motivation, being motivated to stay. That's not just feeling like you're stuck and you have to stay because you can't make as much money somewhere else. It's being motivated to stay. It's going above and beyond what's required, which is nobody has to stay with our organization. So we're going above and beyond, and building a resilient workforce means when things get tough, they go above and beyond and they stay and kind of help that organization get better because they're engaged and it's meaningful to them. And then their commitment and their connection to the organization. So engagement is, I'm going to argue engagement is actually the thing that we should be focusing on the most when it comes to retention strategies. Now, there are 3 factors that lead to engagement. Now, the reason I've got that picture behind is because we're going to use a kind of an analogy as we're talking through this. These 3 factors are segments of a structure, the structure of our organization. And those 3 factors are contractual factors or contractual principles. You might call them categories, psychological principles or factors, and emotional factors. And what we're going to find is that when we go from top to bottom here, from contractual to emotional, the glue of retention and the motivational factor when it comes to engagement increases exponentially as we go from the contractual to psychological and the psychological to the emotional. And that there's methods we can kind of tie all of these together. There's been a lot of research in the last 100 years kind of on that organizational psychology discipline. And I'll reference a few studies that has come out of that research as we're going through. We won't spend a lot of time talking about those, but there's been a lot of research that kind of supports this principle right here, these 3 factors. And it also ties in very well to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you guys are familiar with that, might remember that back from our psychology class in college or high school. There's a lot of correlation with this and what we understand regarding human nature and psychology. So let's talk about the first one, contractual. This is what the employee receives as they work for our organization. This is what they get. This is that tangible thing that they receive: salary, bonus, benefits. In here is rewards and retribution. Within this is also kind of some basic working conditions. But primarily we're talking about salary, benefits, overall comp. This is in the realm of extrinsic motivation. So this is external factors related to rewards, retribution, or basic working conditions. Can also include the workload. So this is what we typically intuitively think of as kind of our primary tool to retain people. I can't tell you how many times, and we probably all have experienced this, when we find that a key person is leaving, and we ask ourselves, how do we keep them? Can we make a counter offer? Can we pay a little bit more? By the time that happens, there's almost too much water under the bridge. It's very difficult to go back and make a change there. Now, these factors are important. They're very important. And these are the foundation of our structure as an organization, our people structure as an organization. And so this is very important, but research suggests that this is less important than we might think it is. I'm not going to spend a lot of time pulling up slides with studies, but this was a really interesting meta-analysis, which a meta-analysis is when a researcher looks at a whole bunch of different studies and kind of pulls all that information and correlates it together. And I don't remember, for those of us that it's been a few years since we were in our statistics class. We probably don't remember correlation factors necessarily. I remember I had to go back and refresh my memory on this a little bit. That section I have circled is where job satisfaction and pay satisfaction align. And what it's basically saying is if it's less than 1, which that is 0.14 and 0.22, that there's very little correlation between those. And so what this study showed, and there's been a number of studies that it doesn't necessarily reflect it in this much of a summarized manner, but there's been a number of studies over the years that have shown that those contractual factors, what people receive from their employment, are not very motivational and doesn't motivate them to stay very much. There's other factors that are much more important to them. It's almost zero. So why is that? Why is it that something that we intuitively think is the primary motivator doesn't really affect things very much? What the employee receives is not that important. Well, there's the reason for that, and this is I'm going to reference, but we're not going to talk about. I'm just going to reference something called the two-factor theory. There's basically two primary factors in the workplace. The absence of one demotivates, the presence of the other motivates. What this means in the contractual factors within pay and benefits is that if that foundation, if the pay and benefits is not adequate, people will leave an organization. If the pay and benefits are adequate, that means that people will be focusing on other aspects of their employment to bring them satisfaction and engagement. You know, when we walk into a building, we rarely think about the foundation, but if that foundation is not adequate, that building is not going to be functional. And then there's also the idea that this can be linked to other things that makes it more motivational. Let's look at the second factor, the psychological factors. These are much more important, much more powerful. This is if the contractual factors are what people get, what they receive from an organization, this is what the employee experiences. And this is where the people interact with the processes, the culture. This is not an intrinsic motivator, this is not an extrinsic motivator. This is intrinsic motivation. So this is kind of like if we were to think about how this kind of feels, you know, many of us have probably been working on something. It might be a hobby, it might be something work related, and we're so engaged in that, we lose track of time. It just flies by. That is the structure that can be related to these psychological factors. That's the motivation behind that. And this is going to include a few things like, you know, affiliation with the organization's mission, its purpose, its strategy. It's a person being part of that success. Clarity regarding people, where people fit, a high degree of cooperation and involvement and ownership, group and individual performance planning, career development plans, and an organizational health, culture, and EQ. Now, organizational health this is one of those things we could probably spend a couple hours on. You know, the reason why the root word for organizational is organ is because it's like an organization is like a living entity. There are pieces and parts that fit together and work together, and that can be healthy and it can be sick. And so we want to focus on the health of our organization to provide better engagement. And culture is kind of all the unwritten things about a company that make that company what it is. And we've all heard of EQ, I think, probably from a personal standpoint, an individual standpoint, emotional intelligence, understanding yourself. Well, this plays out in organizations as well. An organization that's self-aware and understands itself, understands how it interacts with people, and is able to interact in a healthy way, that's a powerful psychological motivator. Now let's look at the emotional factors. This is by far the most important. This is by far the most powerful in motivating people to stay with our organizations with retention and engagement. And number one on this list is relationships. If we were to, research has shown over and over again, the number one reason why people leave organizations is because of their boss. So the relationship that boss has with those individuals is the number one reason they leave. Number two is coworkers, relationships with coworkers. This gets in the factor of trust, how people trust the organization they work for, a sense of being part of something that's good, something bigger than themselves. And then the leaders in the organization show genuine care and concern. So if those are the factors, those are some of the principles, how do we incorporate that into strategy for keeping people? And there's a lot to this, but we're going to kind of summarize and get a high level view here real quickly. Strategy on the contractual factors. We just need to make sure the foundation is adequate. This means that wage and benefits, their equity within the market, that's an external equity, and there's equity within the organization. They make sense to people. Appropriate transparency and trust with wages. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody knows what everybody's making, but they know there's a system in place. And the ability to link compensation to group and individual performance, and link compensation to succession planning and personal development. So that's where the contractual factors become much more powerful, when there's a link to those factors. And then just reasonable working conditions and working conditions free of conflict. I'm going to show you a slide here that is kind of the foundational of contractual of wages and benefit, wages anyhow. Some of you probably have a wage scale, which you see kind of a segment of that on the left there. Having a wage scale in place as a foundational principle for compensation strategy is very helpful. And then having certain jobs that fit within that wage scale, which is kind of what you see in that right-hand column, is helpful. And people understanding where they fit. They don't have to necessarily understand what everybody else is making, but they know there's a system, a consistent, objective system in place. And what you see below there is a principle for doing wage increases, where if somebody is a high performer, the multiplier for their COLA wage increase is greater than somebody that's an average performer. And this is a system, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but this is a system that can create a lot of objectivity and help an organization create the links here between fair pay and benefits, or adequate pay and benefits, and those psychological factors that are much more powerful. And the psychological factors that are important to focus on, where there can be a strategy associated with this, is creating clarity on an organization's mission and strategy. The identity of the organization. As I work with companies, I often find that there's sometimes there can be confusion regarding that organization's primary purpose. And I'll give you kind of an example of what that could look like in terms of organizations that might seem very similar, but can actually be very different in their purpose and their culture. And understanding that in terms of where the employee fits is very important. Give an example: BMW and Harley Davidson both make motorcycles. Well, BMW is all about performance. Harley Davidson is all about the experience of the ride. So hiring an engineer at Harley Davidson that wants to take the vibration out of the motorcycle probably won't help very much with that engineer's engagement, because they're not a fit. So the basic foundation of just understanding an organization where they fit within the market is very important. There's the EQ, culture and organizational health aspect. And the way you can apply this strategy is just knowing yourselves. Do this through regular surveys, do this through 360s for our leaders. One of my clients has they've got about 14 or 15 different locations, and they do roundtables 3 times a year actually, where the CEO and some of the executives just do a roundtable lunch with some of the employees, listen to them, and then take some of that information and apply it. Clarity regarding each person fits, that kind of fits within that first bullet point I was just talking about. High degree of cooperation, involvement, and ownership in an organization. So ownership is extremely important. I'll give you a quick illustration of something I was reading not too long ago. I'm kind of a history buff, and I was reading about the early settlers in America. When the Puritans settled in Plymouth Plantation, They kind of held all things in common. It was very cooperative, almost a communal kind of a situation. Nobody owned anything in particular. Everybody owned everything together as a collective. And even after they learned how to farm, they just couldn't seem to get people motivated to get to the point where they weren't almost starving every winter. So a few years into it, they decided to do something really radical. They divided up all the land. They said, okay, this is your portion of land. We're still going to help each other. We're going to still cooperate, but you're responsible for this portion of land. That degree of ownership then led to much more success within that colony, and they never starved after that. Our employees want to experience the same thing. Now, obviously, we're not going to divide up the company, but they need to feel like they own aspects of it. And this can be accomplished through teams, Kaizen events, even something as simple as a project team or a process improvement team. Career development path. There's been studies that have shown that organizations that have career development paths will retain their employees much more than other organizations. And training is especially important. In fact, there was a study done by an organization called Burson, which some of you probably have heard of. They're kind of like a Gallup type survey. And they found that when an organization has development plans for their employees, they increase retention by 400 and 500 percentage points. So that's a very significant part of retaining employees, is having some kind of career path in front of them. Now, the relational factors, we're just kind of summarize this. We're kind of toward the end of our time here, because I think we just have a couple minutes before Q&A. And I think a lot of this, I'm looking forward to that, because I'm looking forward to hearing what your thoughts are on some of this. But our strategies for the emotional factors or the relational factors, we mentioned that much has to do with the relationship that the leader and the organization have with the individual employee. And leadership training is one of the most important things an organization can do in creating a concise situation where you're building trust and retaining people through those relationships. And there's also significant motivational factors associated with this as well. I'll tell you a quick story where I saw this play out in a very meaningful way. I worked for a company that was a Swedish company that had moved its production facility to the United States. And I was the ops manager for that, in charge of all the production and engineering for that organization. And it was a large organization. We'd have 450 to 500 people at any given period of time. And when that organization moved, we tried to hire all those people at once. It was chaotic. And I came into it right toward the end of that hiring period. But we had turnover that was like 150, 200%. We had fistfights happening in the parking lot. We had nefarious activities happening in the parking lot. We had people walking in with Slurpee cups with alcohol in it. It was just a very, 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 very difficult thing. And we engaged in a series of leadership training with our leaders in different modules. And by the end of that time, our retention was more like 30%. And our supervisors had built such a relationship that one supervisor, when his wife passed away, we had to shut down 3 production lines, because that's how many people wanted to go to the funeral, which is very costly for us. But we saw that as a benefit, because overall that relationship improved our productivity and our retention so much better. So there's some other things that we can do with these emotional factors, is just try to link these things together as much as we can. Having our leaders participate in performance management, having participatory management with teams, and having our leaders participate that as equals. I mentioned that situation where one of my clients, the CEO, goes to all organizations 3 times a year and sits down for lunch and just talks to them, and he knows many of them by name. And then coworker relationships are very important. We tend sometimes to ignore this, but that's the number 2 reason people leave organizations. So I've actually done respect and dignity training with employees to help them relationally. But creating authentic opportunities for relational connection. This can happen a lot with teams. It can happen with events. Acts of service is a great way of doing this. You take some of your you take some coworkers and they go out and they work on a Habitat for Humanity house for half a day during working hours is a great way to do that even. So those are just ways to kind of pull that group together. So that's just kind of a high level, quick review of all those things that can kind of lead to great retention in an organization. I do have my contact information here. I want you guys to feel free to email me or call me. I love doing these things because it usually leads to conversations afterwards, and I really enjoy that. And I know we cover a lot of information in a very short period of time, so I enjoy those conversations and those emails. So feel free to reach out to me. And I think we have time for some Q&A, right, Hannah?
We do,
Yeah,
absolutely. So if anybody would like to share questions for Shawn in the chat, you're welcome to do that. You're also welcome to unmute and share those questions verbally. Just a friendly reminder, we are recording, so feel free to participate in whatever way is most comfortable for you. And I will moderate that Q&A in the chat and with the help of my colleague, Anne. Shawn, I have a question to get
sure.
us kicked off. Um, you were talking about those psychological factors that organizations can help employees understand and communicate clearly to help improve retention. Those things like mission, identity. I'm wondering if
Mhm.
you see any ways or could comment on how you've maybe seen this done well where cooperatives particularly can leverage their purpose, right? That cooperative advantage that we talk about and see,
Mhm.
or even the cooperative principles, to contribute to some of those psychological factors. Do you see that being done? Do you see opportunity for that? Kind of where do you think that sits?
No, I do. I think that's significant. I'm glad you mentioned that because I think cooperatives have a unique opportunity to link those things together because a cooperative has a purpose, a higher purpose than like a publicly traded company where you're just trying to increase stock value, right? So cooperatives are, there's a lot of different kinds of cooperatives. Most of the cooperatives I've worked with are tied in the food and ag sector. That is just such an essential part of our economy. Um, linking the linking the members of the co-op and in creating relational opportunities between members of the co-op and the people that work for the co-op, especially, in fact, I don't even want to say especially the leaders, because really it's everybody. Creating those opportunities. One of the things that I am doing with a co-op right now is it's part of a CEO review process that I'm facilitating, but we're taking board members and the board members who are all cooperative members, and this we've talked about even expanding this beyond board members, just some other co-op members, just taking trips for a few hours and visiting some different facilities where the work is being done and get to know the workers and have a chance to ask questions so that the employees can kind of link that together. And we've seen a lot of really neat emotion, relational success there that hits on so many cylinders that I don't think you can do that too much. So there's a lot of ways to do it. That's just one thing that I'm kind of involved in right now that's just kind of on the forefront of my mind. But understanding the purpose of the organization. Um, I don't know how many of us might still have that paragraph mission statement. Right, a lot of organizations do, and very few people could have that memorized or could rattle that off. But I gave that example of BMW and Harley Davidson. I don't know where they're at with their purpose statements, but a lot of exactly. But I can tell you what they kind of what I'm aware of. And I've helped organizations do this. Take that mission statement and make it into a one sentence purpose statement so that everybody can remember. And like at Harley Davidson is, we're all about the experience of the ride. Just that phrase says so much. And then you have your values as separate statements, bullet points, and then you have some specific statements regarding how that particular organization does business in the market that's unique to another one. So if you have something laid out in a very simple way, that's not a jargony paragraph mission statement, that creates a lot of clarity regarding that organization's identity. And then you use that for your strategic planning. Then you take those strategic plans, you cascade those plans down through the organization, and you have created this incredibly powerful loop where everything is tied together.
That's a good point. I've even seen some co-ops that tie that to their physical environment, right? Where they have, you might be in a co-op where the 7 principles are on the wall when you walk in, or like
Yep.
those kinds of things. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. And finding ways to communicate in multiple ways. In meetings, things are posted on the wall,
Mhm.
memos, all the, multiple communication platforms so that it's clear for everybody.
Yeah, interesting. Kathy is sharing some examples from the cooperative sector for those like powerful taglines. So one of those where the customer is the company.
Oh, yeah, that's
It's a good
great.
way of saying that.
Yeah,
Um,
great.
yeah. I was wondering also, Shawn, if you would comment on at least, one of the things that we see in certain spaces in the cooperative landscape, particularly in agricultural cooperatives, is that co-ops tend to be what I would call lean operations, right? They often are, even the number of people and layers of people that they have tend to be pretty lean. And sometimes I think that can present challenges in thinking about career development pathways. So I'm wondering if you could comment on anything you've seen or ideas you have about how co-ops can create career development pathways even in a lean organization or a small organization.
Yeah, I mean, you can do succession planning at any, even, and I understand exactly what you're saying. A lot of co-ops are smaller, they're leaner. You have those Blue Diamonds and Sunkiss and Sunsweets. Well, Sunsweet's a little different because it's a collaborative. It has a lot of different individual entities part of it, but you have those large organizations where you might have multiples of 1,000 people. But if you've got 20 people in an organization, there might only be maybe 4 or 5 levels in that organization for those 20 people. I think the key there is that within the roles within the roles that they have, identify who those key individuals are, identify who those high performers are, those hypos, and enter into a succession planning and development program for them. It might be the assistant manager. Maybe when the manager is gone, that assistant manager is step up assignment. They take over, which is pretty intuitive, but you might do some training to kind of back that up. That there might only be 3 or 4 opportunities for that in a smaller organization. But for those key people, for those hypos, doing that is a link for them staying. And a small organization, when that one person leaves, it's even more of a disruption. So it's really important to try to create those. But then really focus on the other factors. I mean, I've seen a lot of co-ops where you might have somebody that is operating a bagger in a mill and has been doing that same job for 30 years, and they can't imagine doing anything different, and they love it. And that's because that co-op has done such a great job creating great relationships and all those psychological factors. So it's focusing on all of it instead of just one item. I think that's important when you're smaller.
That's a good point. Yeah,
Excuse me.
thanks for that. Um, we can squeeze in one more question if other folks have it. And while we're watching for that, I'm gonna share just some closing information. Not seeing anything in the chat, but I'm gonna just double check there. Again, feel free as we close this out, if you have questions for Shawn, to share those. But I did want to just thank everybody for their engagement today. Special thanks to Shawn for taking the time out of his busy schedule to join us, to put the materials together, and to join us live here today. And just a friendly reminder that these are a few of MAC's upcoming events here on the slide. We welcome you to engage with those events and find more information at mac.coop. And as we mentioned, your feedback is really helpful to us. So we really do encourage you to take just a few minutes. It's really not very long, just a few minutes to share feedback. And there's a link in the chat. There's a QR code here on the screen. And when you close out your Zoom today, you actually, hopefully, are redirected to that survey. So it's pretty easy to do. You will receive an email with follow-up resources, including the recording. Just please give us a little bit of time to process that recording. Feel free to share that with others from your co-op, or to reach out after the session if you'd like to connect. And help me thank Shawn one more time, and we'll hang out here, and I will stop the recording in case anybody wants to ask a question that way. Thanks so much, Shawn.
Yeah, my pleasure. Great being with you guys.